Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Specialty Crops Risk Management webinar series. Today's webinar is the 8th of our 10 webinar series, and we're happy to have you all joining us today. This series is funded by the North Central Extension Risk Management Center. I'm Olivia Hannan, Education Extension Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I work in the Farm, Food, and Enterprise Development Program, which works largely with specialty producers on a wide variety of education and outreach topics. Joining us today are Dr. Justin Glisan and Joe Hannan. Dr. Glisan has an extensive background in atmospheric and climatological research with expertise in the analysis of extreme temperature and precipitation events. He earned his BS in 2005 and MS in 2007 in meteorology at the University of Missouri, where he concentrated on droughts and heat waves. In 2012, he completed his PhD in atmospheric sciences at Iowa State University with a research concentration on the dynamical causal mechanisms of precipitation and temperature extremes. While at Iowa State University, his research had a strong academic collaboration across a broad range of federally funded projects. His work experience includes advanced atmospheric research techniques, large data machine learning, and statistical analysis. As State Climatologist of Iowa, his responsibilities include quality control of Iowa weather observations, weekly recommendations to the U.S. Drought Monitor, and weekly and monthly climate summaries for state stakeholders. Iowa weather and climate observations go back to 1872 and represent the history of weather across the state. These observations help to tell the story of Iowa agriculture and how resilient and innovative the state's farmers are and have been. Looking at how trends in precipitation and temperature are changing and applying this climatological analysis through the lens of agriculture is also a very important part of the position Dr. Glisan advises the Secretary of Agriculture on climatological matters impacting the agricultural sector. And Joe is a commercial horticulture field specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. His goal is to increase the quantity, quality, and safety of fruits grown in the state through workshops, field days, media, and personal relationships. He has worked in the industry for over 15 years conducting research, providing education to fruit and vegetable farmers, and selling into local wholesale markets. His areas of focus include grapes, apples, and produce safety, and currently he serves as director and co-lead of the North Central Region Center for FSMA Training, Extension, and Technical Assistance. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for the great introduction. I didn't realize how long it was, so we're out of time. I just a point of personal privilege, working with Extension across the state of Iowa has been a wonderful part of my job. They're the eyes and ears on the ground. They do an insanely amount of great work across the state, so it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to work with Extension. So I thank them for the opportunity to be a part of these webinars. So today, as Olivia said, I'm attached to the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And today I will be talking about recent weather across Iowa and current conditions, looking at Western Iowa in terms of drought, but also outlooks as we move into spring and summer. So the presentation highlights we'll have are a brief explainer about weather versus climate, some precipitation and temperature trends that we've seen across the state, both historically and in the short term. Short term in terms of climatology is the last 30 years. And then we'll look at a 2020 summary of precipitation and temperature across the state, which will give us a setup of where we are currently in terms of precipitation deficits and temperature behavior, given that we just recently had a pretty strong Arctic air intrusion with a perturbation in the polar vortex. We'll talk about the polar vortex. Then we'll look at current conditions on the ground, moisture variables, current drought conditions, and then getting into short-term, weekly to seasonal outlooks for precipitation and temperature. Okay, so the first thing we'll talk about is weather versus climate. We think of weather as the day-to-day state of the atmosphere. And these short-term variations on a scale of seconds to minutes all the way out to about 7 to 10 days. We think of seconds to minutes in terms of severe weather, tornadoes, those micro scale events that don't happen that often, thankfully. Derecho, which we had the state's strongest derecho on August 10th, and we're still seeing repercussions of that across the state and across the Midwest. And then out to weeks, the transient low pressures and high pressure systems that move across the United States that bring us our weather. Those are weather events. So we generally think of weather as what's the temperature, what's the humidity outside, is it going to rain today, is it going to snow, what clouds are out there and what are the clouds telling us, things of that nature. So we get a lot of questions. Well, how hot is it? How much snow are we going to get in the next event? Is it going to snow any more this season? Hopefully not, because I'm sick of snow. When we think of climate, climate is actually the weather for a given location averaged over 30 years. And with that averaging over 30 years, we are able to get a baseline in which we can compare weather events. We can rank month, weekly records and give us an idea of how extreme a weather event is. As I mentioned, the August 10th derecho, we've had 10 derechos over the last 30 years. So climatologically, we're about we average one derecho every 2 years statistically. As I mentioned, this will go down as the strongest derecho in history. And an interesting note here, derecho was derived by Dr. Gustavus Hendricks at the University of Iowa in 1888 to differentiate between straight-lined wind events and tornadoes. So we think of Dr. Hendricks as the first official weather observer and effectively the first state climatologist west of the Mississippi. So this climate information that we get from our weather stations allows us to build statistical weather information that we can then compare and contrast. For example, the polar vortex, the 7 to 10 days of the extremely cold temperatures that we had was the coldest stretch of days that we've seen since 1936. So this gives us a way to rank things, but also to differentiate between extremes and not so extreme events. So if we think of this in terms of an elementary school figure, those wiggles that you see on the top plot, that's the temperature variation on a day-to-day basis. You average those wiggles together, you get that green line, and that green line is climatology. So then we can use that baseline to compare how hot or how cold it is. We can also look at seasonal variation. We always expect winter to be cold, summer to be warm. Typically, on an annual basis, you average all those months together. We're right near normal, given that temperature doesn't vary as much as precipitation, and I'll show that. So if we take the climatological data from our National Weather Service co-op stations across the state, we're able to develop precipitation and temperature trends, both historically and going back 30 years, as I mentioned, the climate decade. Historical, the record starts in 1895. That's the official federal record. Now, in my office at the Capitol complex, right behind my shoulder there, I have records back to the mid-1800s. We don't touch those records because they're in fragile condition and they will be shipped to the state librarian. But I digress. Let's look at some temperature and precipitation trends. The first of which we'll look at is the annual average temperature across the state of Iowa since 1895. The higher the peak, the warmer the year, the lower the trough, the colder the year. Now, if we look decadally since 1895, we've seen a 1/10 of a degree increase per decade since 1895. So where we are now, we're about 1.2 to 1.3 degrees above the atmospheric temperature that we had in 1895. So we've seen a warming across Iowa and effectively across much of the mid-latitudes. Now, by a physical relationship we call the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, any increase in the amount of atmospheric temperature necessitates an increase in the amount of water vapor that can be held in the atmosphere. So typically a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature gives us a 4% increase in water vapor holding capacity in the atmosphere. And given that proxy relationship between temperature and water vapor, what we've seen, and the trend lines didn't get on this plot, but what we've seen across the state, again, this is the annual average precipitation. The higher the peak, the wetter the year, the lower the trough, the drier the year. What we've seen decadally since 1895 is a little over 0.4 of an inch increase in precipitation across the state. I'll draw your attention to the wettest year on record, of course, the Great Flood year of 1993. A second wettest year on record was actually recently in 2018. The 12th wettest year was just last year, 2019, or 2 years ago. So if we take those two, 2018 and 2019, and put those 2 calendar years together, the wettest 2 calendar years on record going back 149 years. So we've been in a very wet stretch. Now we're starting to dry out, which of course will have implications in this coming growing season, which my colleague Joe will go over in his part of the presentation. So now we'll look at the same trends, but for the last 30 years. So we can compare and contrast where we are versus the historical record. In terms of the 30-year temperature going back to 1990, we've actually seen a doubling of the temperature across the state of Iowa, and this is reflective of much of the Midwest and mid-latitudes, I should say. So we've seen a 0.2 degree increase per decade over the last 30 years. So we've doubled the warming that we've seen in the atmosphere. And by our proxy relationship, the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, we've seen wetter years. So we're almost 0.7 of an inch per decade above where we were over the last 126 years. So we're definitely getting wetter. We're getting warmer. But what this betrays is this is a statewide average. We have to remember that specific locations are getting wetter, especially over northern Iowa. But we're also seeing drier conditions form in southern Iowa, which is typically the wettest part of the state. So we're seeing that behavior shift further north as we see an expansion of the Corn Belt further north as well, given the more amenable conditions. So our trend summaries show that in the long term, going back to 1895, but also in the short term, the last 30 years, we've seen an increase in temperature, and by proxy, more water vapor in the atmosphere, we receive more precipitation events. One thing to note is that higher intensity rainfall events are becoming more numerous. So we're seeing higher intensity and more frequent rainfall events. If we were to look at central Iowa, which is climate division 5, we have 9 climate divisions across the state. Looking at the last 20 years, the probability of having a 3-inch plus rainfall event over 24 hours has gone from 0.01% historically, so very, very low probability, but it's tripled to 0.03%. Well, anytime you triple a probability, that suggests that behavior is changing. So we are seeing more intense rainfall events. And when you do have more intense rainfall events, you see more runoff behavior because that water is not able to soak in. So we see more aerial flooding, we see more flash flooding. Those are the things that we need to take into account as we move forward. That's why cover crops, for example, is such a good idea because it acts to lock in that subsoil in case we do get into runoff events when we don't have a crop in the field. Another thing of note, and Joe will talk about this in terms of the practical application in terms of specialty crops, is increase. So we're seeing wetter springs and we're seeing wetter falls. And I just got a notice on my screen that my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully I'm coming through fine. But if we look at the middle in between, we're seeing summer rainfall on the decline. And we've seen this in the climate models going out to the end of the century, that in the summertime, when our crop is maturing, when our livestock are stressed given the warmer temperatures, and we're stringing together more days and heat waves, we're losing out on that rainfall. What we've seen over the past recent history is that after the first week of July, the faucet typically turns off for a few weeks and we don't see very widespread rainfall in July. And that's of concern. And we've seen this in the historical record, but also projections out into the future. So over the last few years, we've also seen wet springs and wet autumns, which have delayed field work, have delayed harvest. Last year we had a very great planting window in mid-April to mid-May. And then we had drought and derecho, which took care of a lot of the crops, both row crops and specialty crops. But these are the trends that we're seeing in terms of precipitation. So something to keep in your mind. Now we'll look at the 2020 summary, kind of give us an idea what 2020 brought us and where we are on the ground condition-wise, because last year's behavior does impact the next growing season. If we look at the final climatological summary for Iowa, the statewide average temperature was a little over 49 degrees, and that was 1 degree above normal, and that ties 4 years for the 33rd warmest, 5 years, I should say, 33rd warmest year on record. Precipitation, we were actually below average. Given that recent few years of very wet conditions, we had a little over, or a little under 29 inches of precipitation, which was about 6 inches below normal, and it was the 36th driest year on record. So going from second wettest year to 12th wettest year to 36th driest year, kind of a flip of where we've been. A warmer year last occurred in 2017, while a drier one was last recorded in 2012, when we had a very pervasive and widespread drought across the Midwest, including much of Iowa. This is basically the departure map in Fahrenheit, degrees Fahrenheit. So the higher that bar, the warmer the month, the lower the bar, the colder the month. What you can see here is that a majority of our months across the state were above average temperature-wise. Of note, November was the 10th warmest, and October was the 6th coldest, but nothing really stand out in terms of widespread lengths of warmness or cold conditions. And this is pretty typical when we look at temperatures. On the other hand, precipitation is where we see a lot more variability. So where you see those blue bars, that's where we had above average precipitation for a month. And it only occurred in 4 months, January, March, September, and November. Then you look on the bottom of that axis of those pink bars, the lower those bars go, the drier those months were. If we look at February, February was the 13th driest, April was the 17th driest, and then August was the 3rd driest, right when drought conditions were starting to become more widespread across west central Iowa from that D3 core, and then starting to spread out effectively much of western Iowa, and then into Nebraska and the Dakotas, where the current drought depiction shows us, and I'll show that later. If we look at, this is a radar and rain gauge estimate of the amount of precipitation that fell across the state through calendar year 2020. Wherever you see warm colors there, that's where we saw precipitation deficits. Wherever you see that red coloring, that's anywhere from 12 to 16 inches of below average precipitation last year. And those precipitation deficits actually started stacking up in the fall of 2019, especially in west central Iowa, where you see that red coloring. That's where the D3 corridor first started popping up in July into August. And then we had an expansion of that D3 into a secondary region across northwestern Iowa, which has been the wettest part, or the driest part of the state. It has missed out on a lot of rainfall. Wherever you see those cooler colors, greens and blues, that's where we had above average precipitation across the state. And wherever we see that, it's basically in that northwestern or northeastern corner of the state. So the story out of this is we come into the growing season this year with the subsoil profile not fully charged as it was this time last year, given the extremely wet years that we had. So these are of concern moving into the growing season. If we look at the climate divisions, as I mentioned earlier, Climate Division 1 is in Northwest Iowa, Climate Division 9 is in Southeast Iowa. We look at those Western climate divisions, Climate Division 1, 4, and 7, 9th, and 8th driest years on record. So as I mentioned, we had 36th driest year on record. Western Iowa had top 10 driest years on record. So this is where we see those drought conditions continuing to be present. On the flip side of the state, climate divisions 3 and 6 were actually slightly wetter than normal, top 40, 42, 39th. So pretty stark reminder that precipitation is becoming more variable, and we have to take that into account as we move forward in our risk management assessments. Okay, so of note, the last in February effectively is the polar vortex. The polar vortex, as I'll explain, has always been there. It's a feature in the Arctic. There's another polar vortex in the Antarctic. Polar vortex is always there. Now, perturbations in that vortex or dips occur because of special events that happen up in the Arctic, and I'll kind of cover that. But we'll get an idea of how often those Arctic air intrusions occur and what kind of impacts they have. We have one of our bureau chiefs here at the Iowa Department of Agriculture has a farm east of or west of Des Moines with peach trees, and the killing temperature on those peach trees, or the peach blossoms, is negative 18 degrees. Well, unfortunately, we hit that this time, given the expanse of cold temperatures, extremely cold temperatures. So he's not expecting a peach crop this year, which is unfortunate given the same polar vortex that we saw back in January 2019 actually did the same thing. A polar vortex, as I mentioned, is always there. It's effectively a low pressure center that sits over the Arctic basin that effectively locks the cold air. It dams the cold air where it should be over the Arctic. And then surrounding the polar vortex is a polar jet stream. The jet stream is a west to east stream of very fast moving air that actually pulls and pushes low pressure systems across the United States. That's how we get our weather makers. You might hear me in other presentations talk about the storm track. Well, the jet stream drives the storm track. What had happened and we saw this initially in the early parts of January, is a sudden stratospheric warming event on top of our troposphere where weather occurs, started to push and pull back and forth on the polar vortex. And the normal circular behavior that we see in the polar vortex started to destabilize and started to wobble back and forth. Well, when you destabilize that polar vortex and it starts to wobble back and forth, the normal west to east flow across the mid-latitudes starts to break down and it starts to slow. You start to get a warm air intrusion as the colder air starts to intrude into the mid-latitudes where we live. And you start to see meanders form. Now, where those meanders form, that's where the dam breaks in the polar vortex. And that's where that Arctic air is able to gush down into the mid-latitudes. The start to February, the first 14 days was the coldest first half of February on record. If we were to end February on Valentine's Day, it would have been the coldest February on record. Looks like we'll be top 10 coldest when the month ends, but extremely cold air. And we saw those impacts in Texas. That's how far that cold air was able to intrude. So if we look at February 7th through the 18th, right in the teeth of the Arctic intrusion, wherever you see those pinks and purples, that's where the temperature, the minimum daily temperature, so overnight lows, were below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. We had temperatures up across the Dakotas in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, negative 30, negative 40. Mapleton in Western Iowa actually recorded a overnight low temperature of negative 35, its coldest temperature on record. Now, Mapleton doesn't have the longevity scale of observations as other National Weather Service co-op stations that go back to 1893, but that was a pretty substantial cold air outbreak. For reference, the coldest temperature that we've recorded across the state was negative 47 degrees at Elkader and Washita. So we didn't approach that. But what was of note during this current outbreak was the length of time in which temperatures were way below average. Our daytime highs were actually below what our climatological overnight lows should have been. So very, very cold air. Okay, so now we'll talk about current conditions. And number one, I showed you the precipitation departure that we saw from 2020. Well, this is from January 1st, 2020, all the way through yesterday. And we still see those precipitation deficits. We haven't really corrected those with regular rainfall or regular snowpack. So we're anywhere from 15 to 18 inches below average. Much of western Iowa is below average. 6 to 15 inches below average. So that subsoil is really dry. Now, if we look at the last 30 days and the last 60 days, 30 days on the left, 60 days on the right, we've actually seen above average precipitation across the state, basically snowfall. But it doesn't take a lot during the driest part of the year, December, January, February, to get above average. So take this plot with a grain of salt and look back at those larger scale deficits which will impact the growing season. If we look at modeled snow depth of the current snowpack, anywhere from 4 to 12 inches going from west to east across the state. Now, of note here is the snow water equivalent within that snowpack is not the depth, okay? Basically what we see across the state within that snowpack is 2 to 4 inches of liquid water. So if we were to melt that snowpack all in 1 or 2 days, we would get 2 to 4 inches out of it. Not enough to correct those deficits that we see in western Iowa. And given that the soil is pretty dry and frozen in western Iowa, you're not getting a lot of infiltration deep into that profile. You'll see some muddy conditions as the snow melts and we warm up, but that snow water equivalent liquid water is not infiltrating deep enough to recharge that subsoil profile. We'll take any moisture that we can get, but we do need regular rainfall as we move into spring. Current drought depiction, again, that D3 extreme drought area still remains across northwestern Iowa, which is the driest part of the state. And then we have anywhere from D1 to D2 conditions across western Iowa, with the D1 corridor still where we have that longer term precipitation deficits. Now, given shorter term wetness that we've seen over the last 6 months and below that 6-month threshold, we have seen some improvement, but not enough that would necessitate the removal of drought across western Iowa. Wherever you see the yellow colors, that's D0 or abnormally dry conditions, not drought, but those are it's a sentinel for us to keep watch over those areas, because if we do get into dry conditions, those parts of the state can deteriorate rapidly if we do get into flash drought conditions. If we look at a 3-month change in the drought monitor, wherever you see green here, that's where we've seen improvement. Now that's basically because of snowpack melt, but also some timely rainfalls during late fall. So we have seen some improvement, but not a majority improvement that we would like to see. Given fall, we should see more rainfall than what we've seen over the past 30 years. Soil moisture, if we look at that first top 10 centimeters, wherever you see green there, that's where we're actually above average percentile wise. So 70% and above, which is good for that top soil. But if we go down to 80 inches, wherever you see orange or red colors, that's where we're at the 20th percentile or below. So if you think of a sponge, that sponge has 80% capacity for more subsoil moisture. So it's only 20% stocked. We need more subsoil moisture. As I mentioned, we were at the 99th percentile across the state this time last year. So the subsoil profile was loaded and ready to go for the growing season last year. And it actually tied us over as we started to get into drought conditions in June and July. So we did have ample subsoil moisture, but we've used it up. If we look at the 3-month difference in the soil moisture, we've actually seen an increase across much of the state, a little bit of a decrease in northeastern Iowa where we've seen drier conditions form. But the story out of this is the subsoil profiles are dry and we need to have them restocked by timely rainfalls. I'll skip this plot because it tells the same story. Seasonal drought outlook, wherever you see brown there, we're predicting that drought will persist, and this is valid until May 31st. So we still see in our outlooks the probability of drier than normal conditions over these drought areas. So we do think that drought conditions will persist. Whether we see improvements in those categories, we're unsure of, but those will be dictated by the outlooks, which I'll show you shortly. Finally, the main points I want to make: drought and abnormally dry conditions are unlikely to improve or degrade substantially. Now, we have seen improvement, but we won't see whole large chunks of that drought area degraded or improved until we start to get into the middle of spring, when our rainfall should start to pick up climatologically. As I mentioned, winter is the driest season for us, and it doesn't take a lot to get above or below average rainfalls or snowfalls. Soils are still frozen, but starting to thaw. If we get into what I like to call the 40-20 rule, highs during the day in the 40s, lows at night in the 20s, gentle thaw and refreeze, able to get some infiltration into the subsoil. But when you get temperatures up in the 50s, as they were yesterday, you do get into rapid melting. La Nina, I'll talk about this when we get to the outlooks, looks to persist longer. And with it persisting longer, our modeling in analog years in which La Nina has been present do show us that probability of drier conditions is out there as we move into late spring and early summer. All right, so finally, the last part of my our presentation are the outlooks. They're based on probabilities of being wetter or drier or warmer or colder. They're not the forecast that we see on TV. They're probabilistic. So they give us an idea of the temperature will be above average, precipitation chances will be below average, but not by how much, just a robust guidance that we can expect behavior above or below what we would expect climatologically. And these incorporate numerical forecast models, oceanic effects, La Nina, El Nino, other large-scale oscillations that affect the storm track across the United States, and then recent trends in climatology. We can skip this for time's interest. We have our initial short-term outlooks are 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 days, and these are issued daily at about 2 p.m. Central Time. On the left-hand side, for all the rest of the plots that I'll show you, is temperature. Right-hand side is precipitation. Wherever you see warmer colors, that's where the probabilities are suggesting elevated probabilities of warmer than average conditions. Wherever you see blue, the reverse of that, colder than average. On the precipitation front, wherever you see greens there, that's where we see elevated probabilities of wetter conditions. Flip side, where you see browns, elevated probabilities of drier than normal conditions. So what we see in the short-term outlooks going out into the first week of February is we're seeing a pretty strong signal for warmer than average temperatures, and then near normal to slightly elevated probabilities of wetter than normal conditions across Iowa, especially the southern half for wetter conditions. If we look at the 8 to 14 day, which I copied and pasted the same, sorry about that, we're seeing a similar signal in the temperature field. Now you're not seeing it here, but what we're seeing in those 8 to 14 day pretty much mimics what we see in the 6 to 10 day outlooks. If we look at the 3 to 4 week outlook, this gets us into the middle of March. We're seeing high probabilities, 60% or greater, of above average temperatures. And then an EC, or what we call equal chance of above, below, or near average conditions. Kind of the climatological coin flip. We're not seeing clear guidance from the longer term forecast and outlook models, but this is tied into the phase of El Nino, or phase of ENSO neutral, which we'll talk about as we move forward. March's initial outlook again shows us an elevated shot at warmer than average temperatures for much of Iowa. But then we get into where La Nina's fingerprints are shown. This is a classic La Nina signature in which you see elevated probabilities of wetter than average behavior over the Ohio Valley and then up into the Pacific Northwest, and then high probabilities of drier than normal conditions across the high plains into the desert Southwest. Iowa happens to be right on the interface of this. Now, in the last iterations of the monthly and seasonal outlooks, we have seen some semblance of those elevated probabilities of wetter conditions start to push further west. And you can see this in the March, April, May outlooks. Again, the elevated signal for warmer conditions for March, April, May, and then probabilities starting to sneak into extreme eastern Iowa for the possibility of wetter than normal conditions. Looking at April, May, June, getting into the growing season, again, that temperature pattern seems to be locked in for above average temperatures. And then we kind of see that La Nina signature again start to shift further west into the eastern half of Iowa. So possibility of wetter conditions there. And then again, EC for western Iowa. May, June, July, this is the 2.5 month lead, so we still have some time for these to update. Again, no clear signal. This is partially responsible for a 60% possibility of transitioning from the La Nina phase to what we call ENSO neutral, or right between La Nina and El Nino. And if that does indeed occur, the probabilities do rise for the wetter than normal conditions versus if La Nina sticks around into summertime, where we have seen analog years in which La Nina has been present for drier conditions across the Midwest. So more on that to come as we move into spring and summer. Here's my contact information. Please contact me with any questions. I'm always happy to chat and provide information, and thank you for being with us.
I guess that's the key for me to switch over. Thank you, Justin, for setting up such a great discussion. I could have probably just talked my remaining time on the notes that I took here as we got up and going. So again, I'm Joe with ISU, primary focus on apples and grapes and produce safety. Used to do a lot with veggie crops. And maybe if I can get this thing to work. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about the wet, dry, wet pattern that Justin talked about, as well as talk about the, what I want to say, as well as talk about the warmer temperatures that we are looking at, or how those warmer temperatures, daytime, nighttime, impact our crops. And my share screen, I should probably do that, huh? There we go. That's better. I'm like, I can see what I'm looking at. You can't. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about pests. So when we're looking at pests, and when I talk fruits, I mean anything that's coming from a flower. So that's our tomatoes, our peppers, our cucumbers, our melons. It's our strawberries, apples, grapes. And when I talk veg or vegetative growth, I'm talking a lot of our greens and brassicas, just so we're kind of clear there, because a lot of the fruit crop behaviors and the fruiting vegetables will be very similar here. So as we're looking at early season wetter conditions in spring, the challenge on the horticulture side is that when we have new young growth in the springtime, that green tissue is typically more susceptible to disease infestation. It really doesn't start to get any or get a lot of resistance to diseases setting in from wet conditions until that vegetation matures and starts to get a thicker epidermis to it. So that means as we're going into wetter conditions, we're going into higher rainfall totals at some of these times when we do get rain. You're looking at greater chances of fungicides washing off the plants, and just overall difficulty of keeping fungicides on the plants. As we go from vegetative growth in the spring into more of our blooming stage for apples, grapes, strawberries, early season tomatoes, peppers, cukes that are out in the field, a lot of our diseases that affect our fruit will actually internalize at time of bloom. So you'll get a disease infestation starting or infection starting at bloom, and then as that flower closes or matures into a fruitlet, it encapsulates that disease organism and holds it there and protects it there until fall, when things start to kind of go into that final maturing stage. As we go into summer, a lot of our diseases become significantly less challenging or less concern for us, as we don't have a lot of dry diseases. I mean, it's not to say that there's none, but most of our diseases that we deal with on specialty crops are going to be leaf wetness type deal. So, I mean, dry summers, that's great. That's one positive there. But then as we go into fall, once those fruits start to become mature, so again, the tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, apples, grapes, those fruitlets or those fruits become susceptible once again to diseases. And so that you're having to step up your disease management program going into your final harvest time period, which is a huge challenge and concern because A, you got to be putting on products close to harvest. B, you're not wanting to put on products close to harvest because a lot of your clients or customers don't want products on the fruits when they're buying them from you. So it becomes very, very challenging in order to kind of fit and meet in all that and stay legal with your harvest intervals and things like that. So definitely challenges and concerns. As we look at this from a nutrient standpoint, again, challenges when we're looking at wet spring. That wet spring is going to hold or pull down that soil moisture temperature, which is then in turn going to limit or minimize nitrogen being released from microbial breakdown of organic matter. So we're having less available nitrogen for that early season pickup by crops, meaning you may need to apply some additional nitrogen early season to kind of make up for that until soil temps do warm up and you start to get more of that nitrogen release going into summer and fall. Compounded with those wet conditions and hot, heavy rainfalls, you may end up with some leaching of sulfur and boron, which means you may need to do some additional supplemental applications to make up for that loss early season, especially if it persists into summer. So if we end up with a wet summer as well, not just a dry summer, you're likely going to need to kind of make up for some of that. As we go into dry summer, our conditions start to change. We're going to have shallower roots from the wet spring, but now we need to hope that our root systems are going downwards, going after that water. And as that soil dries out, our potassium starts to get locked out where plants can't get it. So you may need to do some additional potassium applications to make up for the locking up of potassium in the soil. Really common to see potassium deficiency showing up on tomatoes. We often will see potassium deficiency showing up in some of our fruit crops as well. So think of like our grapes would probably be the biggest challenge that I see it on. And so you may have to do some supplemental potassium applications as that soil dries out with your irrigation system, but still needing to maintain balance with the potassium applications with your side dress calcium applications for blossom end rot management or bitter pit management and things like that. So it's really starts to become a very fine line or fine balance to have to walk during that summer as you're starting to manage multiple nutrient impacts here as you're going out through the season. As you go into fall being wet again, there's not big giant impacts on fall outside of late season tomatoes and grape harvest and things like that. So, all right, so sliding on and looking at product quality. I had already mentioned that we have diseases will want to get in and establish themselves in the flower as the fruits are setting. So now as we go in that wet spring, dry summer, things are slowing down. You're not seeing a lot of disease getting established during that dry period. But then again, as we go into fall, you start to see those disease organisms start to reinvigorate themselves and start rotting out your fruits. And so I think we got sour rot in grape, but you can insert or plug in any other fruit here and see the same thing. What did I else want to mention here? Okay, so we look at some additional product quality things. So early season, when we have lots of moisture, that's when anything that is a fruit is starting to undergo cell division. So at the cell division stage, water can be a limiting factor in determining what your total crop yield will be and the total size of the fruit that you harvest. That's all determined in a fairly short period after bloom. Going into summer, the fruits kind of settle down, and that's, that green stage. So again, that could be a fruit, or it could be a vegetable fruit like tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. They're settling down. So going into a dry summer doesn't necessarily hurt you here at all. And then going into a wet fall, that's where it could kick you a little bit. That wet fall condition can cause all the cells that you created in the spring to overly expand and end up with a watered down product at the end of at harvest, where you're thinning out the amount of sugar that you're getting in the fruit, and or you're just leaching that sugar directly out of the fruit. And so that definitely has an impact on your harvest that you're getting. As we're going into wetter fall, often that means more cloud cover, which can reduce sugar formation as well, and it can reduce the quality of product that is ripening. You need sunlight to get onto any sort of fruit in order to actually get the best quality possible. You got to have that fruit, or you got to have that sun on the fruit. Anything else I wanted to mention there? Okay. So we'll come back to move on to temperature a little bit. The person that Justin mentioned over in our neck of the woods here that has peaches and sweet cherries knows better. Just because we might be seeing a little bit warmer temperatures during the winter doesn't mean that we don't have these polar vortexes and cold spells coming down. So no, you still can't grow peaches here. You still can't grow cherries here. You still can't grow vinifera grapes here. Please don't call me and ask you how to do it, because you can't do it reliably. So as we go into these time periods, having a warmer winter is actually really, I want to say advantageous, but the opposite of advantageous. It's a huge challenge for us. When we're not going into full cold winters, our crops are not going into full dormancy, so that when you do have a cold oscillation like we saw for early February, those first 2 weeks, those plants have not gone into their full maximum hardiness. So you might expect, and actually I would expect this year, that you will see more damage after that cold oscillation, 2 weeks of terrible coldness. I would expect to see more damage than had we been consistently riding at 0 degrees all of January going into this cold temperatures. But because we had a lot of, frankly, it's been a very nice January and February from a human standpoint, the plants weren't as winterized as they should be. So then as we look at, okay, well, they're not as winterized as they should be. They've already met their chill requirements. Now that we're going into this February time period, we're going to start seeing active movement of fluids in our trunks and crowns. So think in our apples and grapes here. During the day, when we have even just 35, 40 degrees with sun and then dropping down below freezing at night, you can have some cellular damage to trunks and canes. We could actually start to see more pronounced injury from not having it, or from having slightly warmer winters. So not as nice as it is from a human standpoint, it's not good from our perennial crop standpoint. You have to stay on time here, because I told Olivia I would stay on time. Okay, so now as we're going into our growing season and looking at our daytime temperatures. So while we may not necessarily be seeing a lot of warmer temperatures or just slightly warmer temperatures throughout the summer months, we do have impacts to those crops, or to our crops. So we're looking at tomatoes, peppers, apples, strawberries. We can see more incidents of sun scald from direct exposure, especially as we're going into late summer, early fall, going into our harvest. Tomato example here is very classic sun scald on tomatoes, where you don't have a lot of leaf canopy, so you've got direct sunlight on there. You got very high summer temperatures inside that high tunnel, and you're preventing the formation of lycopene. And that's super common under very warm summer conditions. Let me see, what else do I want to mention on warm temps? As we look at warm temperatures going into early summer, and actually throughout summer, we could also be looking at quality issues on things like our strawberries, our raspberries, again, our tomatoes and things to some extent. And let me see here, what else I want to say. Okay, so challenges again with any sort of fruiting crop. As we start to look at our vegetative crops, so think any of our greens, early season, spring or fall, think of any of our brassicas, spring or fall, we do need to have nice warm daytime temperatures, but what these warmer oscillations in the spring and fall is going to get people to want to plant further and further and further outside of our normal planting window here in Iowa. And you have to keep in mind that we do have to deal with those colder nighttime temperatures still dipping below freezing and making sure that you're providing some protection. So with all of these challenges that we have on fruits, on vegetables, on vegetative vegetables, we do have some cultivars and things that will help us avoid some of the challenges. So anytime we're looking at vegetables, we can breed vegetables very quickly. Just the way that the breeding system is set up for vegetables, we can stay on pace with changing and evolving climate conditions. So look for things that will tolerate high heat. We have lots of tomatoes, we have lots of peppers, we have lots of beans, we have lots of our cool season crops that are much more tolerant to heat. A lot of our lettuces, a lot of our brassicas are becoming more tolerant to those conditions. On the fruit crop side of things, fruit crops are typically bred at our universities around the country, and it is a much slower process to breed and develop fruit crops that have resistance to diseases, that have tolerance to high temperatures, tolerance to cold temperatures. And so we can't really keep up with pace as climate changes. It's very difficult to keep up with pace, and thus we see a lot of injury with our fruit crops. So we talked warm days. Warm nights is the one that people kind of forget about. And anytime you have a fruit or a vegetable, the daytime is when you get your sugar accumulation. The nighttime is when we go into dark respiration. And that's where your pH comes up. That's where your titratable acidity or that tartness in your mouth comes down, becomes more palatable. And that's where you start to develop your tannins, and many other of your flavor components are developed during your nighttime. And having warm nighttime temperatures prohibits or inhibits the development of those quality components on your fruits. You need to have a warm daytime. You need to have a significantly cooler nighttime temperature in order for fruits to properly develop and give you that very high quality local food flavor. We even see this with vegetative crops, where having warmer nights or having cooler nights helps stems to develop thicker, helps with better branching, better root development, and once again, better flavor components. So you still want to have cooler nights when you're looking at your greens and brassicas. So otherwise you get essentially what I call heat ripening, where you get this wonderful product that looks gorgeous, but it tastes like junk, or it tastes like nothing because there is no flavor there. And that's typically more related to warm nighttime temperature than it is your daytime temperature or anything else. So as we look at all of these different challenges, we do have some solutions when it comes to growing the crops. A lot of the solutions when you're looking at fruit crops, so apples, grapes, strawberries, is physical infrastructure. It's putting up hay growth tunnels, it's putting up shade structures, it's putting up frost protection systems in some way, shape, or form. Those are available, but they're expensive. And then you can still have a derecho come through and take it all out and have to replace it with no insurance cost supporting it. when we get to the vegetable side of things, we have more expanded options. Obviously, we've got a lot more availability for buying and choosing cultivars that have heat tolerance and have disease resistance and things like that. So look at those options going forward for on the veg crop side of things. So that is probably more than my 10 or 15 minutes that I told I would take. So with that, I think I'll take a break. Olivia's laughing at me, but I'll give you still a few minutes time to ask questions.
Perfect. Thank you both, Joe and Justin, for joining us today. If anybody does have any questions, please do drop those in the chat box, and either Justin or Joe will get those answered. Next week, we have Craig Chase on budgeting for specialty crops. So please join us again next week at noon. And with that, I will do another call for questions.
While we're waiting for questions to come in, I can certainly attest to Justin's comment on snowpack being 2 to 4 inches of water. As I walked out into my backyard the other day, thought I was stepping on snow, and I stepped into 4 inches of water. Little frosty underneath there yet, so it's still sitting.
Yeah, you get that crust that forms, and it's yeah, we had Lake Glisan in my backyard in Beaverdale in Des Moines, so very rapid snow melt yesterday. We were, the forecast was 39 degrees, I think, yesterday. We were at 55. So that shows you how fast that snow melt can impact surface temperature. I do have a question for Joe. Where do you see us in terms of current conditions on the ground moving into the growing season for specialty crops?
I'm really worried on anywhere where we were notably dry. I got a lot of reports that wells were actually dry. Not just my own, but I know several other folks that said they were struggling with water, had been pulling real water for quite a while last year. I actually got a call a couple weeks ago from a gentleman over in eastern Iowa growing strawberries, again, in that's shallow-ish well, so 100 feet or less, whose well has gone dry too. And so from a fruit crop standpoint, I'm worried that we don't have enough soil moisture deep down. I'm especially worried with some of our crops over winter here. Well, I was worried that having a drier soil moisture conditions going into winter, that we would see more root and crown damage. Fortunately, things seem to stay a little bit warmer, so I'm not too worried about it at this point, but I was. Veg crop standpoint, boy, we irrigate. That water's got to come from somewhere, and we're short.
Yeah.
Not to rain on anybody's parade, but I'm definitely
Everybody work on their rain dance.
right. I've been doing it. It ain't working.
Justin, I was going to kind of ask a question along those same lines there. We're obviously seeing a greater variety of climate events, call them what you will. Long term, do you kind of see that continuing?
Yes, that's a great question, and it's very topical for everything that we do in agriculture. Given that I had mentioned the polar vortex, why that destabilizes is because of the temperature gradient between the mid-latitudes and the high latitudes. We have what's called Arctic amplification, which is the high latitudes are warming at 2 to 3 times as fast as the mid-latitudes. Given whole-scale warming across the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, we should say, we're relaxing that temperature gradient. You relax the temperature gradient, it slows down the jet, destabilizes the jet, so you get those meanders that form. You get those meanders in summertime or spring, as we did in 2018. You get record wetness across parts of the state because that storm track is just locked in. So to the broader point, yes, where we're seeing more variability in the climate system, and our extremes are becoming more extremes, whether they're cold extremes or whether they're warm extremes. We're seeing more extended heat waves. Joe had an excellent point about daytime highs versus overnight lows. I mentioned the last 30 years, we've seen a 0.3 of a degree increase per decade. Much of that is coming from overnight temperatures trending up. So we're seeing more water vapor in the atmosphere, more cloud cover at night, locks in that surface temperature from the day. We can't cool down. When you don't cool down those days, then you get perpetual strings of days in which you're above average temperature-wise. So yes, we are seeing the extremes lock in and become more extreme. So drier droughts, wetter wets, and flooding events. Look at 2008, 2011, 2019 with the bomb cyclone event in southwestern Iowa, effectively 100-year floods in 10 years. So we've heard from a lot of civil engineers that perhaps with our return periods, a 500-year flood right now is no longer a 500-year flood. It's, you take one of those zeros off the end of it, a 50-year flood, for example. So yes, we are seeing extremes become more extreme. Now, the silver lining there, and I don't want to take too much time, is with a relaxed temperature gradient in the atmosphere from the wholesale warming of the atmosphere, we're actually relaxing the instability in the atmosphere. Less instability, less severe weather events. We got into drought in western Iowa because we didn't have thunderstorms last year. We didn't have a lot of severe weather last year. No thunderstorms, you can't get severe weather. So looking at the derecho, the August 10th event will be the strongest derecho to go through Iowa in terms of agriculture, but also insurance loss. I think we're $11 billion right now. We're less likely to have strong events like that, thankfully. But when we do have them, they can be explosive.
So it's going to be easy to let your guard down and get caught. So don't let your guard down, just knowing that stuff may be a little less frequent, but it still can happen.
Absolutely.
All right, with that, I do not see any questions in the chat box. So thank you to both of our speakers for joining us, and thank you to those attendees who hopped on, and we hope to see you all next week.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.